Hello everyone, my name is Delphine Hochstrasser. I'm a philosophy and politics student at the University of Edinburgh. I hope everyone at home is keeping safe, and thank you so much to the Political Studies Association for allowing me to present my research. So my research question is, what narratives were expressed of Raila Odinga's decision to boycott the Kenyan 2017 re-election on traditional versus new media? Before I get into my methodology and my results, I'd like to explain the timeline so we have a context of what was going on at the time. So on the 8th of August, Kenya had its presidential election. The forerunners were Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta. Uhuru Kenyatta is the incumbent president of Kenya. On the 11th of August, Uhuru Kenyatta was announced the winner. But on the 18th of August, Raila Odinga filed a petition to the Supreme Court claiming that the election was marred with irregularities. On the 1st of September, in a historic moment, the Supreme Court of Kenya annulled the election and called for a re-election to be scheduled. On the 10th of October, Raila announced his decision to boycott, called his supporters to boycott at the polling stations and boycott goods and services of those who supported Uhuru and his party. And on the 26th of October, the re-election was held, with all of Raila's supporters boycotting the re-election. So my research is about understanding what narrative was created of this political event on traditional versus new media. Traditional media in my research is represented by newspapers, namely two local newspapers in Kenya, The Star and The Daily Nation. New media is represented by Twitter. Raila is a prominent Kenyan politician. He's had several ministerial roles and was the Kenyan Prime Minister in 2008. He's ran for the presidential bid about 4 times. Most prominent was in 2007, where he ran against Mwai Kibaki, lost, called his supporters to protest, which led to what is infamously called the 2007-8 post-election violence. The 2017 Kenyan election was a very important one. The IEBC invested millions of shillings into digitizing the electoral system in the hopes of increasing transparency and preventing instances of ballot stuffing. Now that we understand the role of Raila Odinga in the 2017 Kenyan election, let's look at the factors that influence the narrative on newspapers. In my literature review, I discussed 2 themes that I think are the most salient in the literature. One is the issue of state censorship, where the state indirectly and directly censors what information is placed in newspapers. The second is the issue of peace journalism, which I think is very important to the Kenyan context. It's described as the deliberate deletion, omission, or exaggeration of news coverage to prevent inciting conflict. I think this is very important within the context, considering the 2008 post-election violence, where the media was blamed for inciting conflict and tensions further. Now moving on to what factors influence the narrative on Twitter. I think the big appeal of Twitter is in its ability to shift authorship of the narrative from the state to the people. And specifically in Kenya, it's not inhibited by the constraints of peace journalism. One factor that does influence narratives on Twitter is the issue of user engagement. Narratives are propelled by users engaging with the content through liking, commenting, and retweeting. Despite the appeal of Twitter, I think it presents several limitations within the Kenyan context, which are important to note. My research fills a gap in the literature because it's able to compare how narratives are expressed on traditional versus new media in Kenya during unprecedented political events. From the literature review, I've constructed 6 hypotheses. 3 relate to Twitter and 3 relate to newspapers. Now moving on to the methodology. For the newspapers, because it was hard to find online archives, I used the National Library of Scotland's e-resources, where they had online archives of newspaper articles from both The Star and The Daily Nation. The second part of my methodology was using the idealized reader framework, which is about understanding what narrative the average reader attains from a very minimalistic reading of newspaper articles. The third part of my methodology was about elucidating newspaper stance using what Bednarik calls her evaluative parameters, namely emotivity, sourcing evidentiality, and sourcing style. The fourth part of my methodology was what I called topic category, which is about coding every single time a source was quoted and what they were quoted in reference to, under a list of 9 different themes ranging from the boycott to in support of their party or in discussions about the IEBC. Now moving on to my methodology on Twitter, which contains some consistencies with the methodology on newspapers. I chose to look at tweets from @Raila Odinga, and ideally I would have looked at Uhuru, although his account was deleted under very ambiguous circumstances. The second best option was Williams Ruto, his vice president. I then quoted each and every single tweet for Twitter style, which elucidates how exactly politicians tweet during elections. The third part of my methodology was the idealized reader framework to ascertain what the narrative was like on Twitter. The fourth part of my methodology was coding each and every single tweet for its topic category. The last part of my methodology was looking at what type of content users engaged with most from both Raila and Ruto. To do so, I took the top 10 tweets which scored the highest in comments, retweets, and likes from both accounts. Now moving on to my results. On newspapers, I found that the idealized reader framework results did not confirm hypothesis 1, that newspapers would sanitize Uhuru's representation more than Raila's. The emotivity results did confirm that newspapers did not use emotive language. And results from sourcing evidentiality and sourcing style also confirmed hypothesis 3, that newspapers would adopt a neutral reporting style. And lastly, my topic category results confirmed hypothesis 1, which was that Uhuru's representation would be sanitized more than Raila's. Now moving on to my results on Twitter. My Twitter style results did not confirm that Raila would use Twitter to shape the narrative in his favor by discussing specific issues. In fact, what I found is that Ruto used Twitter more as a platform to discuss issues. My idealized reader framework results did not confirm that Raila would use Twitter to shape a different narrative by discussing different reasons and facts for the boycott. My topic category results did not confirm hypothesis 4C, which assumed that Raila would use Twitter to discuss different topics that were not found on newspapers. And finally, my results on the top 10 comments, retweets, and likes confirmed hypothesis 6, that the tweets which performed the highest in engagement discussed emotive language or content. Now moving on to my conclusions. What do all of these results say about the narratives on traditional versus new media? What I found is that there was no significant difference in what narrative was expressed. Instead, the difference was in how the narrative was expressed. Generally, between the two platforms, the facts and reasons about Raila's boycott were generally consistent. Although, on newspapers, there were still indicators of peace journalism, where newspapers were not using emotive content or language and discussed and reported in a neutral way. And on Twitter, the content with the highest level of engagement used emotive language and content, thereby showing that the difference wasn't in what narrative was expressed, but instead the difference was in how the narrative was expressed. Again, my name is Delphine Hochstrasser. Thank you so much for listening to my research, and I hope all of you at home are keeping well.